I knew something was wrong the moment my son stopped asking and started deciding. He did not come to visit me that day. He came to replace me. In his voice, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only quiet certainty that my life, my home, and everything I built would soon belong to him. What hurt the most was not the plan itself, but how easily he believed I would step aside. He thought I was fading. He thought I would not see it coming. He was wrong. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I am Margaret Whitlock, 72 years old, and I have spent most of my life building things that cannot be easily taken apart. My home in Charleston, South Carolina, sits on a quiet stretch near the water where the air carries a faint trace of salt and the evenings settle into a slow golden calm. The house is not grand, but it is strong, intentional, and earned through years of careful decisions. Every beam, every polished floorboard holds a memory, and those memories are tied to choices I made with clarity and discipline. Most people assume I'm simply a retired widow who fills her days with books and gardening. I allow that assumption to exist because it keeps the world simple. What they do not see is the life I lived before this one. For more than 30 years, I worked as a forensic financial auditor, specializing in uncovering fraud that hid behind polished language and respectable appearances. I learned to read patterns in numbers and behavior, to see where greed disguised itself as necessity, and to understand how people justify taking what does not belong to them. After my husband passed away, this house became both my anchor and my proof that I could continue on my own. I maintained everything myself, from the finances to the repairs, not out of obligation, but out of respect for what we had built together. Control, to me, has never meant power over others. It has meant understanding every detail well enough that nothing can be taken without my knowledge. My son, Ryan Whitlock, is the only family I have left. He is 35 years old, and for most of his adult life, he has struggled to find stability. I have helped him more times than I can count. What began as small support gradually became a pattern I chose not to examine too closely. I told myself that everyone finds their way eventually if they are given enough chances, and I wanted to believe that he would. Ryan has never been openly cruel, but he has always been drawn to shortcuts. He looks for outcomes before effort, for opportunity before responsibility. Recently, he became engaged to Lauren Caldwell, a real estate attorney with a quiet confidence and a mind that misses very little. When I first met her, I noticed how she observed my home. Her attention moved across the structure with precision, measuring without touching, assessing without speaking too much. It was not curiosity, it was evaluation. I tried to welcome her into my life. I wanted to believe she might bring structure to Ryan, that together they might create something stable. But in the weeks before their visit, small details began to accumulate. Ryan asked questions about the value of the house, about taxes, insurance, and long-term maintenance. Lauren asked about my daily routine, how often I left the house, and whether I had considered other living arrangements. Each question was reasonable on its own, yet together they formed something else entirely. I have spent too many years recognizing patterns to ignore one forming in my own home. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building beneath a surface that still appears intact. By the time they arrived that afternoon, I understood that something was coming. I did not yet know its exact form, but I recognized its intent. For the first time in many years, the pattern I was observing was not part of a case file, it was part of my life. If you're still watching and starting to sense where this is heading. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. They arrived just before the light began to soften in the late afternoon, that quiet hour when the house usually felt most at ease. I heard the front door open before I reached it, the sound sharp and certain, not hesitant. Ryan stepped in first, moving with a familiarity that bordered on assumption, and Lauren followed close behind, her gaze already sweeping across the room as if she were cataloging it. There was no pause, no moment of acknowledgement that this was still my home. Ryan set his keys down on the entry table without asking, and Lauren drifted toward the windows, studying the view with a focused calm. I stood in the hallway for a second longer than necessary, watching them settle in, noting how quickly they occupied the space. It was a small shift, almost invisible, but I felt it immediately. We gathered in the sitting room, and Ryan began speaking about the wedding, his tone measured, almost rehearsed. He spoke of timelines, arrangements, and the future, but there was something structured in the way he presented it, as though each point had been prepared in advance. Lauren sat beside him, composed and attentive, stepping in occasionally to clarify details or expand on certain points with precise language. The conversation moved gradually, almost carefully, toward a different subject. Ryan began to mention my living situation, framing it in terms of concern. He spoke about safety, about the risks of living alone at my age, about the size of the house and the effort it required to maintain. His words were smooth, but they carried a weight that felt misplaced. Lauren followed, her tone even and professional. She spoke about options, about communities designed for comfort and care, about environments where everything was structured and managed. She described these places with an attention to detail that suggested familiarity, listing amenities, services, and the kind of support systems that would remove uncertainty from daily life. She did not ask what I wanted. She explained what would be best. I listened without interrupting. The language they used was careful, almost strategic. It reminded me of the reports I used to read, where conclusions were guided by selective framing rather than outright statements. Nothing they said was technically wrong, but the intent behind it was clear. Ryan eventually moved to the center of it, stating that I should consider relocating. He presented it as a transition, a natural step, something that would benefit everyone involved. There was an ease in his voice that suggested the decision had already been made. Then he added the part that mattered most. After the wedding, he and Lauren planned to move into the house. He said it plainly without hesitation, as though he were describing something already in motion. I felt the shift settle fully in that moment. This was not a conversation. It was a presentation of a plan. They were not asking for my agreement. They were outlining my role in their future. I remained still, watching them, letting the silence stretch just long enough to observe their reactions. Ryan looked expectant, Lauren composed. Neither of them appeared uncertain. In my work, I had learned that people reveal more in what they assume than in what they say. And in that room, my son assumed that I would step aside. The realization did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. Something between us had changed, and it was not going to change back. If you're still watching and felt that shift in power, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. A few days passed after that conversation, but the house did not feel the same. The quiet that once settled naturally into every corner now carried tension, like something unseen waiting beneath the surface. I moved through my routines as I always had, tending to small tasks, keeping order, but my attention sharpened. I had learned long ago that when people reveal intent, action follows soon after. That morning began like any other. The light filtered through the tall windows, soft and steady, and I was in the kitchen arranging a simple breakfast. There was comfort in repetition and the predictability of small habits. But then I heard it, a sound that did not belong. A dull thud, followed by the scrape of movement, and then voices, low and unfamiliar in tone. I paused, listening more carefully. The sounds were coming from deeper inside the house, not hesitant, not cautious, but deliberate. I set the dish towel down and walked toward the hallway, each step measured, my thoughts already aligning with possibility rather than surprise. When I reached the living room, I saw them. Ryan stood near the center of the space, speaking to a man I had never seen before. Lauren was nearby, holding a tablet, her attention moving between the man and the structure around them. The stranger held a measuring device, scanning the walls, noting dimensions, occasionally crouching to inspect the flooring. They had not called. They had not asked. They had simply entered. For a moment, I stood still, taking in the details. The man's tools, the way Ryan gestured casually as he spoke, the quiet efficiency with which Lauren observed and recorded. It was not chaos. It was organized, purposeful. I stepped forward, and only then did Ryan glance in my direction. His expression did not carry guilt or hesitation. It carried mild acknowledgement, as though my presence required only brief adjustment. He explained that they were getting ahead of future plans, that it made sense to begin evaluating the space early. His tone was light, almost dismissive, as if the situation were entirely reasonable. Lauren added that this was simply part of preparing for a transition, her words carefully chosen, her delivery calm and controlled. The man continued working, unfazed by my presence. I felt something shift inside me then, not in anger, but in recognition. This was no longer conversation. It was implementation. Ryan moved closer, his posture changing slightly, his voice lowering into something that resembled patience. He suggested that I was becoming overly sensitive, that I was misinterpreting their intentions. There was a subtle emphasis in the way he spoke, a quiet suggestion that my perception might not be entirely reliable. Lauren reinforced this without saying it directly. She spoke about stress, about how change can feel overwhelming, about how important it was to ensure stability moving forward. Then Ryan mentioned it. He said they had already spoken to legal counsel. He framed it as precaution, as something responsible people do when planning for the future. He used terms like oversight and protection, words that sounded harmless until placed in context. Financial guardianship. The phrase settled into the room with a weight that neither of them acknowledged. I understood immediately what it meant. I had seen this pattern before. First, establish concern. Then, question capacity. Finally, introduce control as a solution. They were not improvising. They were following a structure. I looked at them both, taking in their composure, their certainty, the absence of doubt. There was coordination between them, a shared understanding that this was already moving forward. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I stepped back instead, allowing the moment to settle without resistance, because in that instant, something became perfectly clear. This was no longer about protecting me. This was about replacing me. If you're still watching and realizing this situation just crossed a line. Now let's move on to chapter 4. When they finally left, the house returned to silence, but it was not the same silence I had known before. It felt heavier, as though something had shifted permanently beneath the surface. I stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, looking at the spaces they had measured, the areas they had already begun to imagine as their own. Nothing had been physically taken, yet something had already been crossed. I did not feel anger in the way most people expect. There was no sudden surge, no raised voice echoing through empty rooms. Instead, there was clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and settles deeply, leaving no room for doubt. I replayed every detail of their visit with precision. The way Ryan entered without hesitation, the way Lauren observed without asking, the quiet authority of the man measuring my walls. It was organized, deliberate, and coordinated. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan already in motion. For years, I had analyzed situations like this from a distance. I had followed financial trails, uncovered hidden motives, and watched how people moved when they believed they were in control. Now, I turned that same discipline inward. I stopped seeing Ryan as my son in that moment and began seeing him as a subject in a pattern I understood too well. The structure was familiar. First, establish concern, then introduce doubt about capability. Finally, position control as a necessary solution. It was a method designed to appear reasonable while quietly removing autonomy. I had seen it succeed in boardrooms and courtrooms. I was not going to allow it to succeed here. I moved into my study and closed the door, creating a space where thought could remain uninterrupted. The decision I needed to make was not emotional. It was strategic. If I confronted them directly, they would accelerate. If I resisted openly, they would adapt. I needed them to continue forward, to believe their approach was working. So I reached for the phone and called Charles Davenport. He answered without delay, his voice steady, unchanged by time. I explained everything in clear terms, outlining the entry, the contractor, the mention of legal counsel, and the shift in tone that had taken place. I did not exaggerate. I did not speculate. I presented facts. Charles listened carefully. When he spoke, his words were measured. He confirmed what I already suspected. If Ryan and Lauren moved forward with a guardianship filing, the process could advance quickly if not challenged early. The situation was no longer theoretical. It required immediate attention. But stopping them was not enough. I told Charles that I did not want a defensive position. I wanted to understand how to remove their leverage entirely. I wanted them to reveal the full extent of their intent, not just the portion they were willing to show. There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, but recognition. He understood. We began outlining possibilities. The key, as always, was incentive. People expose themselves most clearly when they believe they are close to gaining what they want. Ryan and Lauren were not acting out of impulse. They were acting out of need and expectation. That made them predictable. I considered what they valued most. Control of the house was part of it, but not the whole. There was pressure behind their actions, something driving urgency. If I could identify that pressure and amplify it, I could guide their next move. That was when the idea formed, not as a risk, but as a structure. I would give them something to reach for, not openly, not completely, but enough to draw them forward. I would allow them to believe I was uncertain, that I was beginning to accept their version of events. I would create space for them to act without resistance. And when they did, I would be ready. I set the phone down and looked around the room, taking in the quiet that had once felt like comfort and now felt like preparation. For the first time since they walked through that door, I was no longer reacting. I was planning. If you're still watching and you think you know what she's about to do, now let's move on to chapter 5. Several days passed, and I allowed the rhythm of the house to settle into something slower, softer, more uncertain on the surface. I adjusted small details in my behavior, not enough to draw suspicion, but enough to reinforce what Ryan and Lauren had already begun to believe. I paused longer when answering questions, misplaced objects in visible ways, and let moments of hesitation linger where certainty once lived. It was not difficult. People often see what they expect to see. Inside, nothing had changed. My thoughts remained clear, structured, and precise. Every action I took was measured against the outcome I intended to reach. I had no interest in improvisation. This required discipline, and I had spent a lifetime developing exactly that. I waited until the timing felt right before reaching out. When I called Ryan, I softened my voice, allowing a slight uncertainty to carry through. I told him I had been thinking about what he and Lauren said, that perhaps they were right about some things. I mentioned that I had been struggling to keep track of certain details, that managing everything alone was beginning to feel overwhelming. There was a shift on the other end of the line, subtle but unmistakable. His tone warmed, but beneath it was something sharper, more alert. Concern blended with anticipation. I had heard that combination before. Then I introduced the idea. I told him there was an investment account I had not discussed before, something I had kept separate for years. I described it carefully, suggesting that I was no longer entirely confident in how it was structured or managed. I let uncertainty guide the explanation, presenting it as something that needed attention but was beyond my current ability to oversee alone. Ryan responded quickly, assuring me that he and Lauren could help. He framed it as responsibility, as stepping in where I could no longer manage effectively. Within minutes, Lauren was part of the conversation, her tone calm, precise, and reassuring. She spoke about reviewing documents, organizing accounts, and ensuring everything was handled properly. I gave them limited information, just enough to create a clear path forward, but not enough to expose the structure behind it. Access was controlled, carefully defined. Every detail had already been prepared with Charles. Behind the scenes, the framework was in place. The account I described was not a typical investment. It was a monitored structure, layered with oversight mechanisms that recorded every interaction, every login, every document accessed, every attempt to move funds would be tracked and preserved. Nothing could be altered without leaving a trace. I had built systems like this before, though never for myself. Over the next few days, Ryan and Lauren moved quickly. Their confidence grew with each step, their involvement deepening as they became more familiar with the information I had provided. They asked fewer questions and made more assumptions. That was when I knew the structure was holding. I observed quietly, noting the speed of their decisions, the coordination between them, the absence of hesitation. They were no longer testing boundaries. They believed they were operating within them. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, when I felt the weight of what I was doing. This was my son, the person I had protected, supported, and defended for most of his life. But I also understood something I had avoided for too long. Protection without accountability had led us here. This was not about punishment. It was about ending something that could not continue. By the end of the week, I could see the shift clearly. They were no longer approaching the situation with caution. They were preparing to act. And when they did, everything would be recorded. The structure was complete. The path was clear. All that remained was for them to take the next step. By the time they made their move, I already knew it was coming. The activity within the account had shifted from observation to action. Access logs showed deliberate entries, not cautious reviews. Documents had been opened, modified, and signed. Authorization pathways had been tested and then used. There was no hesitation in their pattern anymore, only intent. I sat in my study and reviewed everything in silence. Every timestamp, every recorded interaction, every digital trace aligned with precision. There was no ambiguity left. What had once been suspicion had now become evidence, clean, complete, and undeniable. I did not feel surprised. What I felt instead was a quiet confirmation, the kind that settles without resistance. The structure had worked exactly as intended. They had stepped forward when given the opportunity. They had followed the path I placed in front of them. I called Ryan and asked him to come by that afternoon. I kept my voice steady, neutral, without urgency. He agreed quickly. Lauren came with him. When they entered the house, the atmosphere felt almost familiar, echoing the day they first presented their plan. But there was a difference now. They carried confidence, a subtle assurance that suggested they believed progress had been made. Ryan moved easily through the space. Lauren's posture remained composed, though her attention was sharper, more focused. We sat in the same room as before. I began without accusation. I placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to shift their attention. Inside were printed records, structured clearly, each page aligned with the next in quiet order. I turned the first page toward them. Ryan leaned forward, his expression tightening as he scanned the document. Lauren did not reach for it immediately. She watched instead, her eyes moving from the page to me and back again, already calculating. I continued turning pages. Each one showed another piece of the pattern. Access times, authorization attempts, confirmed changes. The progression was simple to follow. There was no room for interpretation. Ryan's posture changed first. The confidence faded into something unsettled. He spoke, attempting to explain, but the words lacked structure. They came quickly, uneven, searching for ground that was no longer there. Lauren remained quiet, but I could see the shift in her focus. She understood what the documents represented, not just evidence, but exposure. I let them sit with it. When I spoke again, my tone did not change. I explained that everything they had done was recorded, that the system had been designed to capture each step. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply described what existed. Then I presented the choice. I told them that I could proceed formally, that the evidence was complete and could be submitted without difficulty, or they could accept my terms and walk away from everything related to my finances and my home. Ryan looked at me differently then, not as someone he could persuade, but as someone he could no longer reach. He tried to appeal to familiarity, to history, to the years behind us, but those arguments belonged to a version of me that no longer applied. I acknowledged what I felt without letting it guide my decision. Then I told them the final piece. All of my assets had been transferred into an irrevocable trust. The structure was permanent. There was no access point left for them to reach. No future claim, no adjustment, no reversal. The room went still. Ryan's reaction came in silence first, then in fragments of disbelief. Lauren did not speak. She did not need to. She understood the finality of it. There was nothing left for them to negotiate. I closed the folder and stood, not as a signal of dismissal, but as a statement of completion. What existed between us had changed, and it would not return. If you're still watching and didn't expect that reveal, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still here. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The room remained still long after I finished speaking. The air carried a weight that neither of them could move past, no matter how they shifted in their seats or searched for something to say. I watched Ryan first. His reaction did not come all at once. It unfolded in stages, each one revealing more than the last. At first, there was confusion. His eyes moved across the documents again, as if repetition might change their meaning. Then disbelief followed, settling into his expression with a kind of stubborn resistance. He leaned back slightly, shaking his head, as though rejecting what was in front of him could undo it. But the moment did not bend. The disbelief gave way to frustration. His movements became less controlled, his posture tighter. He tried to speak, to explain, to reshape the situation into something less final. The words came out uneven, lacking direction. It was not an argument, it was a reaction. Lauren remained quiet through most of it. Her stillness was different. It was not confusion, it was calculation. I could see her assessing the implications, not emotionally, but structurally. Her gaze shifted between the documents and the space around her, as if mapping the consequences in real time. There was no denial in her expression, only recognition. Ryan's tone changed again, this time sharper, edged with anger. When persuasion failed, he turned to deflection. He suggested misunderstanding, implied that things had been taken out of context, that intentions had been misread. But the structure of his argument did not hold. It collapsed as quickly as it formed. I did not interrupt him. I did not correct him. There was no need. The evidence had already done that. Lauren finally spoke, but not in his defense. Her words were measured, careful, directed more toward containment than support. She did not attempt to justify what had happened. Instead, she focused on limiting the damage, choosing her language with precision. In that moment, I saw the shift clearly. She was no longer aligned with him. She was aligned with preservation. Ryan noticed it too. His attention turned toward her, searching for reinforcement that did not come. The absence of it seemed to unsettle him more than anything I had said. The distance between them widened quietly. I remained where I was, observing without stepping in. There was no satisfaction in what I saw, only the natural unfolding of choices reaching their conclusion. This was not something I had created. It was something they had set into motion long before I responded. Ryan's anger softened into something else, something closer to desperation. He tried again, this time reaching for familiarity, for history, for the years that had come before this moment. But those connections, once strong, no longer held the same weight. They could not undo what had already been done. I felt the pull of it, the instinct to respond as I always had, but I did not move toward it. Some responsibilities must end in order for anything to change. Lauren stood first. Her movement was quiet, controlled. She did not make an announcement, did not explain her decision. She simply stepped back, creating space between herself and Ryan, both physically and otherwise. The choice was clear without being spoken. Ryan remained where he was for a moment longer, as if trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. Then he stood as well, slower this time, the certainty he had carried into the house gone completely. He left without looking back. I stayed in the room after the door closed, listening to the silence settle once more. This was not the end of his life, but it was the end of my role in holding it together. The house felt different after they left, not immediately, but gradually, as the hours passed and the tension that had filled it began to dissolve. The silence was no longer heavy. It settled more gently, as though the space itself had been waiting to exhale. I moved through each room slowly, not searching for anything, but reacquainting myself with what had always been mine. I paused in the doorway of the living room, looking at the places where they had stood, where decisions had been assumed and plans quietly imposed. The marks they left were not physical. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken, and yet the memory of their presence lingered in the structure of the space. I understood then that reclaiming the house was not about restoring it to what it had been. It was about redefining what it would become. I walked through the hallway, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as I moved. Each room held a version of my life that had once felt complete. Now those versions seemed like chapters rather than destinations. I was no longer standing still inside them. In the days that followed, I began making small changes. I reorganized my study, sorted through old documents, and brought order to the things I had not examined in years. I reviewed every account, every legal structure, ensuring that nothing remained vulnerable. The work was familiar, precise, and grounding. It reminded me that control is not something you hold once. It is something you maintain. But there was something else forming beneath those actions, a shift in intention. For years, I had focused on preservation, maintaining what existed, protecting it, sustaining it. Now, for the first time in a long while, I considered the possibility of building something new. I began reaching outward slowly at first. There were local groups in Charleston that focused on financial awareness, particularly for older adults. I had seen too many cases in my career where trust was misplaced and autonomy quietly taken. What had happened in my own life was not unique. That realization settled with clarity. I contacted a small community organization and offered to share my experience, not as a story, but as a framework. I wanted to explain how manipulation works, how it evolves, and how it can be recognized before it becomes irreversible. The response was measured but open. There was interest, and more importantly, there was need. I started outlining what I would present, structuring it the way I once structured case findings, clear, direct, and grounded in reality. This time, however, the purpose was not exposure. It was prevention. Ryan reached out during that time. Messages appeared, first brief, then longer, carrying different tones. Apology, frustration, uncertainty. I read them without responding. It was not out of anger. It was out of understanding. Some distances cannot be bridged immediately, and some should not be. I changed the locks on the house, updated security systems, and finalized every remaining legal detail with care. Each action reinforced the same truth. Boundaries are not barriers. They are definitions. The house no longer felt like something I needed to protect from others. It felt like something I could use, something that could extend beyond me. I stood in the front room one evening, watching the light fade across the floor, and realized that for the first time in years, I was not reacting to anything. I was choosing, and what I was building now was not something anyone could take. If you're still watching and feel how everything is about to come full circle, now, let's move on to the final outcome. Weeks passed, then months, and the rhythm of the house settled into something steady and defined. The quiet I once relied on was no longer empty. It carried movement now, purpose layered into its structure in ways I had not expected when everything first began to shift. The rooms that once held only memory now held conversation, attention, and a kind of awareness that extended beyond my own life. I did not transform the house all at once. The changes came gradually, shaped by intention rather than urgency. The front room became a place where small groups gathered, where I spoke about financial awareness, about patterns of manipulation, about the quiet ways control can be taken when no one is looking closely enough. I structured each session carefully, drawing from years of experience, but also from what I had learned more recently. People listened, not out of politeness, but because they recognized something in what I described. The situations varied, but the patterns remained consistent. I could see it in their expressions, in the way they leaned forward, and the questions they asked afterward. It was not just information I was offering, it was clarity. My role in the house had changed. I was no longer simply maintaining it, I was using it. Each room carried a function now, not imposed, but chosen. The study remained my space for our order and review, while the living areas opened outward, becoming places where others could step in and learn without feeling exposed. The structure itself had not changed, but its meaning had. There were moments, usually in the early morning or late evening, when the house returned to stillness. I would walk through it then, not to check or adjust, but simply to observe. The same light that once marked the passage of time now marks something else. Continuity, not repetition, but movement forward. I thought about Ryan during those moments, though not in the way I once had. I no longer measured his progress against my expectations or wondered how to intervene. I had heard through indirect channels that he was trying to rebuild, that things were not easy, that the stability he once relied on was no longer there. The information reached me without weight. It existed, but it did not pull at me. There was no resentment left. That had faded quickly, replaced by something quieter and more useful. Understanding. Not understanding in a way that excused what had happened, but in a way that placed it where it belonged, as a consequence, as a result of choices that had unfolded over time. I remained consistent in my boundaries. There was no reopening of accounts, no reconsideration of structures, no gradual return to what had been. Those paths had been closed with intention, and they remained that way, not out of rigidity, but out of clarity. One evening, as the light shifted across the front room, I sat in the chair near the window and looked out toward the water. The house felt grounded, not because nothing had changed, but because everything that needed to change had already done so. I was not the same person who had stood in this space months earlier, trying to understand what was happening beneath the surface. I understood it now. More importantly, I understood myself within it. The life I had now was not built on protection alone. It was built on choice. I sit in the front room as the evening light stretches across the floor, turning the wood into a quiet field of gold. The house is still, but not empty. It carries a presence now that feels earned, not inherited. I have come to understand that stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the result of something being settled. When I look back on what has happened, I do not see a single moment that changed everything. I see a series of small recognitions, each one leading to the next. Trust shifting into doubt. Doubt turning into observation. Observation becoming clarity. And clarity, once accepted, refusing to be ignored. For many years, I believed that building a foundation for my son meant removing obstacles from his path. I thought that if I provided enough support, enough stability, he would eventually learn to stand on his own. I confused protection with preparation. In doing so, I allowed a pattern to form, one that replaced effort with expectation and responsibility with dependence. It took time for me to understand that love, without structure, does not strengthen. It softens in ways that can become harmful. Boundaries are not the opposite of care. They are part of it. Without them, there is no distinction between giving and losing. I think of Ryan now without anger. That is something I did not expect when everything first unfolded. I thought there would be resentment, that it would linger in quiet moments or return without warning. Instead, what remains is distance. Not cold, not bitter, but clear. His path is no longer connected to mine in the way it once was. Whatever he builds now will come from his own decisions, not from my intervention. That realization did not arrive easily. It required me to let go of a role I had carried for most of my life. Being needed had become familiar, even when it was exhausting. Stepping away from that identity felt, at first, like stepping into something undefined. But over time, I saw it differently. I was not losing a purpose. I was creating space for a different one. What happened in this house is not unique. I have seen variations of it throughout my career, and now I have lived it myself. The details change, but the structure remains. Trust can be misused. Authority can be challenged. And when boundaries are unclear, they can be erased without confrontation. That is why clarity matters, not just in documents or decisions, but in how we define ourselves within our own lives. We are not extensions of what we provide to others. We are individuals with our own structure, our own limits, and our own right to decide how those limits are held. The house around me stands as a reflection of that understanding. It has not changed in form, but it has changed in meaning. It is no longer something I protect out of obligation. It is something I inhabit with intention. Every room holds not just history, but choice. There is a quiet strength in that. Justice, I have learned, is not always loud. It does not always arrive with confrontation or consequence that can be seen from the outside. Sometimes, it is the simple act of refusing to be moved from what you know is yours. Sometimes, it is deciding that your life will not be shaped by someone else's expectation. I look at the walls, the windows, the steady lines of the structure that has held through years of change, and I understand something now that I did not before. I did not lose anything. I defined it. In the end, what remains is not the conflict, but the clarity it leaves behind. Life has a way of testing the foundations we spend years building, revealing whether they were shaped by fear, habit, or truth. Strength is not found in how much we endure for others, but in how clearly we understand our own worth. Boundaries are not walls meant to divide us, but lines that protect the integrity of what we have created. When we stop allowing others to define our place, we begin to rediscover who we are beneath expectation and obligation. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that restore our sense of self. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories that matter.